Yes, good afternoon, everybody. How are you? This is Arifa from 770 AM. Our website is www.eawaz.com. I am very lucky to bring two wonderful people in this show. Of course, as you know that Dr. Anthony Leeds is always with us all the way from England. Dr. Anthony Leeds is an honorary senior research fellow at the Parker Institute. He has very many other things, but of course today's biggest threats in medical field is diabetes. Diabetes is mother of all sicknesses, and Dr. Anthony Leeds brought it in our notice that it can be reversed, or it can be, I always thought it can only be controlled. But today we have another wonderful person with me, and that is Dr. David Jenkins. He's in Toronto, professor in the Department of Nutrition Science and Medical Medicine, Faculty of Medicine, University of Toronto, a staff physician in the Division of Endocrinology and Metabolism, the Director of Clinical Nutrition and Risk Factor Modification Center in Lia Kai-shing Knowledge Institute of St. Michael Hospital. And he led the team that first defined and explored the concept of glycemic index of the food. Dr. Anthony, I thank you very much for arranging such a wonderful person from Toronto, and I leave rest up to you. Please do introduce in your words about Dr. David Jenkins.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, and thank you, David, for taking the time to join us today. What I'd like to do, if we may, is look at the issue of glycemic index and glycemic load, but it may be useful, I think, to start with dietary fibre and explain to the audience what dietary fibre is and what it can do, because when we move on to glycemic index, of course, there are many factors within food and the way that food is processed and consumed and so on that are influential. So do you mind if we begin by talking about something that you and I were working together on, actually, in the mid-1970s. Could you begin by defining dietary fibre? We go back all those decades.
Thank you, Tony. I think dietary fibre is a physiological term, and unfortunately, clever chemists have spent the last 50 years trying to define dietary fibre. So I will give the audience what I think would be the physiological approach. And that can really be done best by, as you know only too well, because you know many of the characters involved, can only be really talked about when we talk about the history of dietary fibre. I think there was a period back in the sort of 19th century when people were very interested, people like Kellogg and Graham and others were very interested in why we were throwing away part of wheat, possibly they thought the best part of wheat, and just looking at white flour. And so it became a big issue as to why we were not having more fibre in our diet, basically as the brown parts of the wheat, if you like, the parts you don't digest, and also the parts you do digest are associated with it in terms of the proteins, and lipid too. And that was a big debate. And I know that my granny always ate all bran, and because it was Kellogg's and it was high fibre. And everyone was very keen on that sort of fibre. Cereal fibre became a big issue. And I think later on, there was always been this issue with the animal feed, where they had too much fibre in there, and animals were not getting enough nutrient from it, because the fibre that they were talking about was basically fibre which was not digestible, and not digestible in the small intestine or fermentable in the colon. So it was a fairly useless material for them. That's the fibre story. And it didn't really get a lot of traction in the early part of the last century, middle part of the last century, until Dennis Burkitt and Hugh Trowell came back from Uganda, where they'd been looking at this much more seriously. They'd been looking at processed foods and the fact that in Africa, very little food was processed, and it was eaten as you got it from the ground or the tree, basically. And they didn't see any particular diseases that we have in the West for a number of reasons. Obviously, fibre is not the only reason. There were many reasons. But I think the fact that they never saw heart disease in Makerere University, which is a well-equipped university in Uganda, and they never saw diabetes. In fact, Idi Amin, who was the first diabetic in Uganda. I've not particularly fond memory, I have to say. But he was the first, he was the president and was the first diabetic and was overweight. But they never saw these issues. And so I think that made them think very carefully about what it was. And one of the things Dennis noticed was that it was very easy to get patients to pass feces if they wanted to look for infections and these sort of things in the feces. They just had to have a screen and get people to go behind the screen and pass feces, just as you pass a urine sample. And he also noticed that in Uganda, human feces, which I have to say, thank heavens he was very attentive to these sort of things, because many people wouldn't have been. Human feces, he found, were very large. And he defined what the right sort of size and shape of human feces should be, considerably larger than you get in the West. So when he came back to the West, to Britain, and later travelled to North America, etc., he noticed people were suffering from constipation. And this was something that was never seen in those parts of the world where they were free from chronic diseases. So, I mean, they had infectious diseases, obviously, but not the chronic diseases. So he then went to the Medical Research Council in Britain and said, look, together with Richard Doll, who was another friend of his, Francis Avery Jones, who was the father of British gastroenterology, they went to the Medical Research Council and said, we've got to do research on this stuff. And that's really where Tony and I started doing our research in these areas. And I think it was a major, major eye-opener to realize that things that you didn't absorb, things that you had no effect on the upper small intestine in terms of things you absorb, had effects on what you do absorb in the upper intestine, the carbohydrate, the sugars, the other things that you absorb, and actually reduced the rate of absorption. So you reduced the rate of absorption in the small intestine, and then you increased the fermentation of materials that went into the colon. So it was a big change in gastrointestinal physiology, and that's why the gastrointestinal physiologists were the first to really focus on this issue. So,
sorry, but we should of course point out that one of the important developments in the mid-1970s was your observations that some types of dietary fibre in some foods could actually modify absorption, so that, for example, there was a flattening of the blood glucose curve, and that also blood cholesterol was lowered. Now, those are the two clinically very important observations, weren't they? Do you want to expand on that a little bit?
Well, yes. I mean, the interest there was quite simply, as Tony's just said, that we found that these materials that were not, as it were, classified in detail in the food tables as things that you would absorb, interfered with the things you do absorb. So, just as Tony said, the glucose absorption pattern, the digestion of starch and its absorption was slowed in the small intestine, which gave you a flatter sort of blood glucose response, as opposed to a high rise that you might get on a Western diet. So that was one thing. And also, when the food got down to the end of the small intestine where you absorb bile acids, these also tended to be so slowly absorbed that they were washed into the colon, out into the feces. Bile acids are a way that you lower cholesterol by getting rid of bile acids from your body. So this actually did the job of getting rid of bile acids from your body. You need bile acids to absorb fats and things, but you don't need that much of them. So in this situation, Tony's quite correct. You were able to eliminate the product of cholesterol synthesis in the liver, which was the bile acids. So again, causing a draw on the blood levels and lowering your cholesterol levels.
Just returning to the blood glucose effect just for a moment, can you just explain how then from the mid-70s through to the 1980s, a number of groups then tested a whole range of foods and were able to classify foods either as high glycemic index or middle or low glycemic index, and the importance of that?
Thank you, Tony. So you're giving us a lead onto the glycemic index.
Yes.
Well, that's great. So as you can imagine, if something that you didn't absorb affected the blood glucose response to a food, I think we all felt that it was important to look at different fibres, and we found that different fibres had different effects. So those that were more sticky had a bigger effect in flattening the blood glucose, as you'd expect, because they lined the small intestine and reduced the rate of absorption. So that seemed very logical. And then we found that let's test different foods, and we tested different foods, and we found that all of them had very different, sometimes the same, but sometimes very different responses in terms of blood glucose. So we wondered whether that was absorption. So we did in vitro studies. We took out the foods and digested them with human digestive enzymes. And sure enough, these foods were digested at different rates. So we felt, in that case, there's no way that we can tell. So we'd better try and test them on human beings, create an index, and then look at a wide range of foods. And so we started doing that, and others, as Tony said, followed doing this, indexing it to glucose. Initially, I prefer white bread, because if you were to ask me, what's this food do? And I say, well, it's 20% of what glucose does. You'd say, well, I don't normally take glucose, so how does that relate to things? So we said, well, okay, bread is about 70% of glucose, so let's make bread 100%. And let's say what proportion of bread. So if I was to say to you that noodles and pasta are 50% of bread, that makes sense to you. And if I was to say that cornflakes is perhaps 120, 130% of bread, you'd say, wow, that makes a difference. So, using the bread scale, you could then rank foods and discuss them with patients in terms of what the blood glucose response is to that food by comparison with bread. That was the glycemic index.
Yes. So this gave a scientific basis for the choices that are made and that dietitians now routinely use, don't they, in helping people with diabetes, for example. Mrs. Arifa, sorry, you wanted to add
Dr. Anthony, I understand it's a very useful conversation between you, both of you, but this program is also meant for the layman, people like myself, so that we want people to learn something from such a great people like yourself and from Dr. David. So, whatever the conversation, it was a wonderful conversation, but at the end of the day, what I think is, Dr. David, this means adding fibers in our food makes a huge difference for the low absorption of glucose in the intestine, and then controlling the cholesterol as well. Is that?
Yes, I wish it was as simple as that. And Tony and I have had a somewhat academic conversation, and you're right to pull us back. You're right to pull us back to real life.
Yeah.
In real life, certain foods certainly tend to lower cholesterol, and one of the reasons may be the dietary fibre, and some fibres are better than others. So I don't think, unless you want to become a dietitian, you want to get all the information and put it together. Let me give you a shorthand way of looking at this. To lower serum cholesterol, one of the ways that we find is to use foods that are high in fibre. And some of the foods that are high in fibre are things like lentils, dal, which is widely used in India, in Indian cuisine, and has gone into Western cuisine too. And so peas, beans, and lentils tend to lower the cholesterol level. Interestingly, they don't do it probably just by the fibre, they do it by also the protein, the quality of the protein. And it's got a 7S globulin fraction, which may have an effect in lowering serum cholesterol. But from the layperson's point of view, the layman's point of view, eat beans, eat lentils, eat foods with these sort of profiles. What we call the dried beans, dried lentils. Very important part of the diet, and combined with the rice proteins or wheat proteins, give you a very complete protein source. So from a nutritional point of view, if I only want one message to get across to you, please continue to eat lentils.
This is what, Dr. Anthony, I want. I understand you are, but you know what, we don't have IQ like yourself, both of you. And Dr. David, thank you very much. So this means, for my listeners, you must add peas, beans, lentils. You said dried lentils.
Chickpeas, lentils. These are foods that you know about, and we all know about, and are actually very popular, but they're often being ignored. If you want to lower your cholesterol, eat foods like okra, ladyfinger. I mean, you know what okra is.
Yes.
Bhaji and these sort of foods. It's good. I mean, these things have viscous fibre in them, lower cholesterol level, as Tony said. So there are a few interesting foods. A fruit like persimmon are also useful in that respect. You don't want to eat so much that you can't eat anything else. But I'm just saying, as part of your balanced diet.
What about nuts and oats and oat beta glucans?
Nuts and seeds, tremendously useful too. So obviously, I mean, almonds are a favourite, I think, in the Indian cuisine, as they are in the Mediterranean cuisine too. So these things, pistachios, these sort of nuts are useful, as Tony said. So they've got fibre, they've got the right fat, and they've got the right proteins. So I think rather than just focusing on one aspect of a food, if one says that the glycemic index is one of the areas that has alerted us to these foods. That's what it's done. It's alerted us as scientists. And then we will pass along to you the useful information, like eat them. That's the information.
Beautiful, very nice. So this means okra, which is bhindi, everybody must, bhindi, exactly. So everybody, you should, if you want to control your cholesterol, nuts. Now, another question over here. Again, Dr. Anthony, to be honest, I wish we can have a long program with you, but for the ordinary people, we just want to get maximum out of both of you. When we eat nuts, sometimes excess of everything is bad. What measurements do you suggest? How much do you suggest?
Well, I suggest that you have to obviously keep your calories under control, and you're absolutely right. So you don't take nuts as sort of just an addition after you've had a full meal. Incorporate them into your meal, into your dishes, and that's useful. Or if you're going to have a snack, have some fruit and a handful of nuts, and that is your nuts, if you like, for the day. So if you like, a handful of nuts for the day is a good thing to add to your diet. So you're getting very close to what we would call a dietary portfolio. You have many things in your diet. Have a little of this. If you have some nuts, that's great, a handful of nuts. Then have some dal. When you're having a main meal with your dinner, perhaps, have that as a main dish. Then as a vegetable, have okra with it, have bhindi with it. So bhindi bhaji or whatever you want to make, but have that as part of your meal. If you're having a more Western style breakfast, have some oats with it. Oats are also rich sources of fibre, help to lower cholesterol. Have some oats. I would suggest change the sort of milk that you may have. I know everyone in India drinks a lot of milk, but soy milk is, I think, very useful for people and carries many of the things that we want in terms of cholesterol lowering, the right fat profile. So you won't be having your saturated fat that way. So these are the ways that you put together a diet. And you're quite right, I should have spent much more of my life devoted to making these things more common. We've been more intent on putting these things into diets and showing they work. And now I can say they work.
Right. But
Yes,
I think,
Dr. Anthony, you
people,
go ahead. Now, we will definitely do this program in 2 episodes. It's what wonderful people. In my language, we say that they are the wells and we are the people who need them. So would like to, from their intellectual conversation, I will definitely ask some questions. This means one more thing, and then you go ahead, both of you go ahead, and then I'll ask some questions. This means in today's technology, everybody must have some kind of app, so they should know that how many calories do they need according to their age, and then depending upon those number of calories, you should mix all the feed. Do not exceed the amount of calories what your body needs. So now you go ahead, please.
No, I think that's I would agree with that entirely. I think you have to keep good calorie control. Quite frankly, one of the things that you can do to ensure that is put yourself on a scale, because that will tell you if you're taking more calories than you need. If your weight is staying steady, you're equal. If it's going down a little, and you're overweight, it's in very good territory. And you should try and stick to what you're eating. Record what you're eating. My advice is record what you're eating and look at your scales.
Can I just add one other thing to David there? And that is that in previous programs, we've spoken about the importance of portion size and the fact that with time, portion sizes generally have risen and plate sizes have risen and so on. And that people need to get used perhaps to serving themselves or serving others with smaller amounts and finding that acceptable. What do you think?
I think so. I mean, it was interesting. I had to go to Japan, to Okinawa. I was invited. It was a great meeting. It was to celebrate the end of the Second World War, and I was able to visit with Dr. Suzuki, who's the professor of gerontology at the university, and he has 600 centenarians in his practice. And he said you can go and interview with one of them. I can't give you a lady who's 100 because you wouldn't understand. But I have one who's 99, and she has a daughter who's an English teacher. So just right for you. So I went and chatted with her about her diet. And one of the things she said that the older Okinawa people always did was it was an 80% rule. You ate 80% of what you wanted, and you then pushed yourself away from the table after 80%. So the concept of having big second helpings was considered rude. It was just considered not the sort of thing one did. And I know that my granny was the same thing. It was called mismanners. You basically didn't eat too much. And I think that's why I think the Victorians tended to be slim people, much slimmer than we are today. Because there was it was an ethic that you didn't overeat. And I think probably bringing that back again would be a great advantage.
May I just take us back now to glycemic index and glycemic load and bring that...
Dr. Anthony, do you mind if we can take the break over here and
sure.
we'll record our second episode? I'll conclude this show. This means, Dr. Anthony, whatever he told us, we must add fibers in our, I'll repeat, the fruits and vegetables, peas, beans, lentils, दालों का इस्तेमाल ज़रूर करें, okra, which is भिंडी का इस्तेमाल ज़रूर करें, nuts का इस्तेमाल करें. Everybody must have a scale in the home, one thing, and everybody must have some app on your phone, so you must know how many calories do you need. Do not exceed. The last thing what Dr. David said, and I thought about my prophet, peace be upon him, in my religion, they say in your stomach you have three parts, one for the food, one for the water, and keep the third part empty. So that is what Dr. David said, that these are the manners. Do not eat too much, just leave something, or once you are 80% full. But in my religion, our elders, they taught us that three parts of the stomach, one for the food.
So you leave 60. You do better. You leave 66% or so free. So you're even better than 80%. You're further down.
Thank you very kindly. Thank you. So we definitely will meet in the next episode. I thank Dr. David and I thank Dr. Anthony. They will talk about on a higher scale, and I'll talk about at the ordinary level for the layman like myself to understand more and get more out of it. Thank you, both of you, and I'll join you in the next segment.
Thank you.